Lewis lays off the gore for Something Weird from 1967, which opens with what looks like a home movie. A man gets electrocuted and ends up with facial deformities. But not only that, he's suddenly got psychic power as a result of this too. Perhaps it's the lack of gore or the kooky genre-bending storyline, but Something Weird did something weird for Lewis, something he wasn't used to. It lost money, which is a shame because I actually quite liked it. I thought it was fun. I'd never seen it before. This was my first time. Particularly when the deformed hero is offered a cure for his facial wounds by a creepy and very ugly old witch. Basically, she demands, "Love, come and love me," like that. Thankfully, she morphs into a really pretty young starlet for most of the time, only to switch back to like a hideous laughing crone mid-coitus. Talk about being two-faced. Anyway, I thought Something Weird was bizarre and fun, and I thought it really earned its title. I thought it was a good laugh. Anyway, as you can already tell, this set from Lewis is, I mentioned it earlier, it's not just a horror director. He has films in this that include films that you would class as more like straight-up exploitation thrillers. One example of that is She-Devil on Wheels from 1968. This is about a wild, all-female motorcycle gang called the Man-Eaters who run from the law and leave a bunch of injured men in their wake. Now, he made this one to cash in on the American international hit, The Wild Angels, which came out in 1967. And that film, The Wild Angels, kick-started a whole biker movie craze. But it was Lewis that had enough marketing savvy to hop on that bandwagon much earlier than anybody else did. Again, what you might feel is like a throwaway movie is still pretty subversive, with the women being in dominance over the men. But what I think is really interesting is that this dominance that the women have, it's not just based on their sexuality. Yes, there's an air of sex in the film and sexual power in the film, but these women are not just like bawdy women using their bodies to trick and seduce men. No, Lewis has them using violence for power, hooking disloyal boyfriends to their motorbikes and like dragging them off through the streets as a punishment. There's also Just for the Hell of It from 1968 in this set, where a teenage gang start terrorizing a Florida town, vandalizing property, being violent to the locals, generally just like harassing people and being complete jerks to everybody, for no other reason than just for the hell of it. Now, again, Lewis is feeding into the rebellious needs of the audience. With the nudie cuties, he drew audiences who wanted that sexual thrill when they were watching the film. With the gore movies, he attracted the folks who'd never seen so much blood visible on the screen, so he was pushing that button. But in Just for the Hell of It, it's almost like he is appealing to a very primitive, almost childish urge in the audience, and that is the sheer joy of smashing stuff up. Now, maybe I'm infantile, but I can totally see the attraction in smashing stuff up. I once found an old TV set in a dump when I was a kid, and it didn't belong to anyone, and it was being thrown out. And so I remember thinking, yes, and I just grabbed a brick and I just smashed in the screen because I just wanted to see what does it feel like to smash a TV up. I think most people, if they got the opportunity to do that, would get a kind of thrill out of that. There's another non-horror movie in this set that's worth mentioning, well, I must mention, which is How to Make a Doll from 1968, where a nerdy professor guy who has no luck with women and is always getting his tie caught in the door, so he needs to cut it off. Why he can't just open the door, I don't know why. But he and his colleague end up making some kind of sexy women robot type people who come out, and they turn out they're a lot more than he can handle. It's kind of amusing to watch, but there are so many scenes of this film where people are just kind of like standing around a computer while dumbass comedy music plays, and the computer makes the weirdest like human sound. Anyway, it tests the patience, but it's good that it's in the set anyway. A lesser known fact about Lewis is that as well as being a director, he ended up becoming a very respected guru in the advertising industry. And he published many books on direct marketing. He was an expert in that, which just makes sense to me because he was great at that sort of campaign. In many of the interviews that you hear on the set of discs, which Arrow puts in here, brilliantly packs with extras. Sometimes he says the campaigns for the movies were much better than the films themselves. He certainly says that accurately, I think, about How to Make a Doll. For example, the film Color Me Blood Red from 1965 is here. And that had a sort of one-sentence quick-sell concept which must have made drive-in owners' eyes and tills light up. Basically, an eccentric, troubled artist suddenly finds the perfect shade of red in murder, and soon he's gutting people and squeezing out entrails onto his easel, while posh women in fur coats sip champagne and pay thousands for the resulting paintings. Now, this idea has been in other films, this art blood thing, but there's a brilliant high concept simplicity to this plot. I think we should give Lewis respect for this. Roger Corman often sold his movies on the poster, but Lewis, he could sell many of his films in a single sentence. Well, maybe not something weird, but many of his other films, and certainly the one I just mentioned. Plus, the gore levels of these films, I think, can still shock audiences today. I guess that's partly what I was surprised at. I can only imagine how far early Jaws must have dropped at the squelchy gut drilling of the Wizard of Gore. You know, the film has some pretty awful production values. But again, there is a thoughtfulness going on there. This film, which is about, you know, a magician who kills people after his tricks, begins with a speech with some pretty interesting points. It says, torture and terror have always fascinated mankind. Perhaps whatever drove your predecessors to the sadism of the Inquisition and the gore of the gladiator's arena is the same thing that compels you to stare at bloody highway accidents. Today, television and films give us the luxury of seeing grisly dismemberments and deaths without anyone ever getting harmed. I think he nails that idea, really. That's a pretty good point to make. Lewis certainly takes this theme and runs with it in another film in the set called The Gore Girls from 1972, which comes complete with a queasy buttock mashing scene, complete with salt seasoning. Let me tell you a quick story about this film. Personal story. As some of you know already, when I first became a Christian, I was told that I should stay away from the horror movies I grew up with and that I loved so much. And so I did, and I tried. But then over time, I started to sense that they had something to say and that there may be some spiritual worth in exploring these stuff. And also, I'm a human being and I'm not a murderer, so it's not that bad. So anyway, I tentatively started watching horror again. But I remember that in those early days of re-entry into the genre, I watched The Gore Girls for the first time, which is so gratuitous. I remember settling down to watch it, and as I was watching it, I was thinking, oh yeah, horror isn't that bad, it's a fine thing. And then I was watching extreme imagery, and I remember thinking, wow, maybe the accusations of horror being sick has a kind of resonance where you see some of these bizarre scenes in that. Now, it didn't put me off horror, actually, and that's fine, but the point I want to make is this. It reminded me that when you watch horror regularly, it really is easy to get desensitized to on-screen violence. I do not for a second mean that horror fans are desensitized to real-life violence. It's actually my contention that quite a few horror fans, including myself, are actually extremely sensitive to real-life violence and are disturbed by it. And so on-screen violence can be a way of coping with it. But we can get fairly chilled out with the certain extreme images we see on fictionalized form on screen, because we're in a world what we know is not trying to inspire real-life murder. You know, when we watch a horror film, we know it's not being made by real sickos and degenerates. It's just like filmmakers doing make-believe and giving the public what they enjoy. This is, after all, a business, the movie industry, and Lewis knew this very well. But watching these Lewis films back, and knowing the uproar that some of them caused, it is kind of a salutary reminder, I think, that for those of us who are kind of steeped in horror movie culture, if you will, we understand its rhythms and we get its expectations, and also, I think crucially, we get the motivations of the makers and the viewers. But for those who aren't used to horror, who were only ever watching back then, I don't know, like Leave It to Beaver and Mission Impossible or whatever it was on TV at the time, these films threw non-horror people into a level of violence and bloodshed that was hitherto unseen. And it feels to me a bit unfair for us guys to expect non-horror viewers to share our nuanced view of the genre. Even a modern viewer will simply see a woman or a man, usually a woman, let's be fair, on screen being beaten and tortured and cut and dismembered, while leather gloves will squelch and squeeze their brains out. For you and I, there's a kind of innocent childishness to this make-believe. It's the same principle we get when we're kids. You know, when you're a kid, and maybe if you had a brother or sister, and you would love to chew your food up and show it to your siblings. Well, horror movies on the whole aren't wishing to replicate the gore of Lewis in reality. But our non-horror friends and family might not get the playfulness of it, and frankly, the religious communities that are so often against this stuff don't have those same sympathies or indeed knowledge of the horror film community or what it's about, and so they see it as dangerous. All I'm saying is I don't think it's necessarily... Oh, well, I don't think it's dangerous myself, but I also don't think we should act as if their disgust at this stuff is purely prudish or old-fashioned. Equally, horror fans ought not to assume that those who are used to it, used to horror violence, are somehow immune to the horrors of real-life violence. I don't think we are. It's a completely different thing. I suppose us horror fans just have to keep showing to the world that, you know, we're reasonable, well-adjusted, kind, and fairly normal people. Not all of us, but most of us. Watching Lewis talk about his films in this set, you see one of those people. A reminder that this is a director of extremely unpleasant films, but he was like a wonderfully pleasant and affable chap who could make the distinction between on-screen violence and real violence. But alas, the mischievous and the talented Lewis is now gone. Our video, which is cool about them, they didn't need the news of his death to celebrate him like all of those newspapers. They'd already started making this massive showcase earlier in the year. And it really is pretty poignant to see a cheerful, humble Lewis introducing straight to camera 14 of his films in a set that's been barely out a month since he passed away. I have read that some critics of this Arrow set are cross because the films are duplicated in both Blu-ray and DVD, and so they feel it's overpriced to get that amount of discs when you might only use some of them. But to get 14 of his films with so many extras in HD, nonetheless, I think, for me, I think it's worth it if you have the money. As long as you're willing to cope with his level of amateurish gore and sometimes shocking production values. Just a quick note as well before I close. I'm reviewing the Herschell Gordon Lewis Feast set. The shock and gore version of this set, complete with vinyl records and lavish books, sick bags and a severed eye. They're all now sold out. I bet they're probably snapped up by all of those Telegraph readers who learned of this new crazy guy and decided to be intrigued to find out more. But anyway, you can't get them anymore. But you can pay a lot of money for them on eBay, I think. Well, listen, that's it for this episode of the Flicks the Church Forgot. Please do subscribe and follow me on Twitter and Facebook. And if you like any of my videos, could you share them as much as you can, if possible, just to try and get more and more people on board. Oh, and if you're interested, my debut novel, Purged, a spooky crime thriller, will be out in shops on February 16. It's up for pre-order now on Amazon if you're interested. But until then, let's show them horror haters out there that we're basically decent folk. And let's also never forget the Flicks the Church Forgot.